Welcome to the webinar, EPA's Broken Pesticide Program, Immediate Steps EPA Must Take to Protect Human Health and the Environment. It looks like we have about 175 people registered for this webinar. What a wonderful turnout. Thank you for coming. My name is Tim Whitehouse. I'm the Executive Director of Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, also known as PEER. This webinar is being hosted by PEER and the Center for Biological Diversity. For those of you who do not know PEER, we are an organization that defends whistleblowers, shines the light on improper and illegal government actions, works to improve laws and regulations, and supports the work of other environmental and public health organizations. This webinar is timely. We are at a crisis point in the way EPA manages its pesticide program. EPA's pesticide program is failing in its basic mission to protect human health and the environment. This failure has occurred under Democratic and Republican administrations. The consequences of this failure have been significant. If EPA does not launch a corrective course of action, there will be catastrophic consequences for our health and the species that inhabit our Earth. I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's event, Sharon Lerner. Sharon is an investigative reporter who covers chemicals, health, and the environment at The Intercept. Sharon.
Great. And so our peers being other countries and nations that have large agricultural economies. Pesticides are used mainly in agriculture. So looking at how we stack up to other places with a lot of agriculture is a good basis for comparison. And right now, the four largest agricultural economies in the world are the US, China, Brazil, and the 28, 27 countries in the European Union. I don't know, I can't keep track anymore. But those are our agricultural peers. And when you look at pesticides we use in this country and compare that with those three other nations, a troubling trend starts to emerge. If you'll look at the top figure here on the vertical axis, you'll see the number of pesticides that we have approved in this country that are banned or being phased out in the European Union, Brazil, China, at least one of those places, at least two of them, and all three. And you'll see that these numbers are quite high. The numbers for Europe are probably close to about 80 now, since they've banned chlorpyrifos and chlorothalonil in the last 2 years since this study was published. So these numbers are growing. And for the most part, these are not small potatoes. We're talking about pesticides that are very widely used. 10 of the most 25 commonly used pesticides in the United States are banned in at least one of these places. And if you look at the bottom figure here, this is just the volume. We use 322 million pounds of pesticides each year in the US that are banned in the European Union. That is a full quarter of all the pesticides we use in this country, which is just astounding. And the numbers, of course, are quite a bit lower for pesticides banned in China and Brazil, but we're still talking about tens of millions of pounds of pesticides used in the US each year that China and Brazil have said, no way, we don't want these anywhere near our borders. And I should mention that the European Union has a thriving agricultural economy. And so they are still able to compete on the world stage and have this essential part of their economy while still, getting rid of these 70 or 80 pesticides that are really the worst of the worst. Next slide. And so why is this? Why does the US use so many pesticides that are banned in other places? And, the mighty have fallen, quite frankly. In the 70s, the EPA was really the gold standard pesticide regulator in the world. The EPA was formed in part due to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The pesticide office had a clear mandate. They were kicking butt and taking names. We were getting rid of DDT and aldrin and toxaphene and 2,4,5-T, some of these things that never, ever should have been used. And not only was the EPA banning these, they were winning in court when the pesticide companies were challenging them. So it was really a was really a force to be reckoned with, and it's been in decline ever since. So if you look at this figure here, the top part are the numbers that are just reflected in the graph below. So if you look at the vertical axis, we've got the number of pesticides that have been canceled in the United States. Cancellations can happen one of two ways. One is non-voluntarily. That's when the EPA steps in and says, you know, okay, you're done. We're cutting you off. You're out of here. We don't want your pesticide to be used in this country anymore. It's sort of a unilateral action, sort of akin to a ban, although we technically don't ban pesticides in the United States. And then a voluntary cancellation is quite the opposite. You generally have the pesticide company coming to EPA and saying, you know, we're not going to be selling this pesticide anymore. Keeping a pesticide registered in the United States is quite costly. So if a pesticide company is not going to keep selling that pesticide, it makes no sense to keep it registered here. And there's some nuance here. Sometimes there is some regulatory push towards a voluntary cancellation. So keep that in mind. But for the most part, non-voluntary actions are the EPA's unilaterally stepping in and prohibiting this pesticide, and voluntary actions are largely due to economic reasons rather than human health or environmental harms. And you can see for the first 3 decades that EPA was regulating pesticides, they were non-voluntarily canceling about a pesticide a year, roughly 10 a decade. And that's dropped off precipitously to the point where in the last few decades, most cancellations in this country have been voluntary in nature. And that's a problem. I mean, we're relying on the pesticide companies to voluntarily remove these products from the market. There can be some push towards voluntary cancellations, but at the very least, there has to be some amount of buy-in from the pesticide companies. And that's a problem. Sometimes those cancellations will be of really nasty pesticides that should be banned, which is great. But oftentimes it's just due to economic considerations more than anything else. And this has really been driven by just an intense amount of industry pressure in this office and regulatory capture that's really just eroded it to the point where it's just a shell of what it once was. And in fact, not only are we in this sort of state of stasis in this country where we can't purge some of the worst pesticides from our roster, but we're often working behind the scenes in a kind of diplomatic fashion to prevent other countries from taking similar precautions. And a couple of examples here are in the Rotterdam Convention, which is an international treaty designed to reduce trade of the most harmful chemicals in the world. Atrazine was sort of considered as possibly being listed on the Rotterdam Convention. And due to the US and a few other countries, that did not happen. Mexico and Thailand have recently made moves to ban glyphosate. Mexico is still currently moving forward with that despite intense pressure from the US, but Thailand ended up reversing their proposed ban due to US pressure that was driven by the pesticide companies. And we've just got reams of FOIA documents documenting this, and it's a real sad state. So you can go to the next slide. So we've got a we're right, everyone else is wrong mentality in this country that dictates a lot of what we do, but it really pervades into the pesticide realm. And I'll just leave you with the example of aldicarb. Aldicarb was one of the few pesticides that EPA, really took a stance on and was instrumental in getting rid of it in 2010. Aldicarb is one of the most acutely toxic pesticides ever used. It's a neurotoxin, harmful at very low doses. It's banned in 125 different countries. I mean, imagine trying to get 125 countries to agree on anything. Good luck with that, but aldicarb is one of those things. It's listed on the Rotterdam Convention, as I mentioned earlier, and it has the highest toxicity category designated by the World Health Organization. It's actually responsible for the largest known outbreak of foodborne pesticide illness in North America. It was illegally applied to watermelons and cantaloupe in California in the 1980s and resulted in over 1,000 people sick and linked to 6 deaths and 2 stillbirths. So imagine going to the grocery store and buying a watermelon, bringing it home and eating it and dying. I mean, you just don't expect something like that to happen in this country, but it did, and aldicarb is the culprit. So this chemical has absolutely no business being used anywhere, much less on our food. But earlier this year, the EPA approved the use of aldicarb on Florida oranges and grapefruits. And this approval allows the use of about 2.5 million pounds of aldicarb containing products to be used on 100,000 acres in Florida. So not only are we not able to get rid of some of the worst pesticides in this country that other countries have shunned, but we're actually sticking our hand back into the garbage bin that we threw some of these things decades ago and taking it out and dusting it off and saying, let's give this a try. It's really a sad indictment of our pesticide regulatory system. So on that high note, I'll kick it back to Sharon.
Yes, that was depressing, but I'm really glad to hear, upset, but glad to hear all of it. But I particularly was struck by the decline, you talk about of EPA, you talk about how the mighty has fallen. And I have been thinking a lot about this change historically. I was reading recently a bunch of documents for a story about paraquat, and historically they go back to the 60s, and you can really see this shift in how the executives, in this case it was predecessors to Syngenta, but how they talk about ETA, they were shaking in their boots in their 70s. Oh my gosh, they're having a meeting about us. We have to respond quickly. And of course, things, as you say, are so different now. And I'm wondering, since you've been so close to all this, if you can point to some specific turning points that look like from your graph, maybe something happened in the early 90s. I mean, obviously you talk about regulatory capture as being the overarching issue, but can you point to any specific moments that led to some of these changes?
That's a really good question. I think this has really been kind of a slow burn. And it's just been, I think the pesticide industry realized in the 70s that this agency was a threat to them. And so, they came up with a plan, and that is, get as much face time with this agency as possible. Laws were passed in the 80s, making sure that pesticide companies were on the hook for a lot of the experiments that were being done. And actually, they ended up funding a lot of the actions of the regulators at EPA. And so there's this sort of influx of money coming in that is funding a lot of these operations. And that not only helps these operations happen, but it in some ways buys access, because they get all these meetings with EPA. They're controlling a lot of the science that EPA is looking at, and so it's just been sort of a slow happening, of just this absolute onslaught of there's this line that is very blurred now of where the regulators begin and the regulated begin, and it's just they almost meld together at this point.
Thank you for that. I wish we had more time. We're going to have more time for questions in general afterwards, but we're going to now move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, who is an agroecologist and director of Ecdysis Foundation, which and CEO, I should say, of the Blue Dasher Farm. So Dr. Lundgren's research and education programs are helping applied scientists and science evolve in ways that foster the movement in regenerative agriculture. So you can take it from here, please.
All right, thanks a lot. And thanks everybody for being here and listening. Next slide. There's cracks in the ice. Our food system is causing a lot of problems. We're seeing widespread biodiversity loss that the planet's never experienced before, and in part that's driven by our pesticide use. There's also weird things happening to organisms that were never expected to be affected. We received a report, me and a colleague at SDSU, South Dakota State University, out of Montana, that said that deer were starting to turn up from hunters that had these jaw deformities, these severe underbites, or overbites rather. And then also 70% of the male deer had some genital deformities. And so we decided to get a graduate student. This was work done by Elise Hughes-Berheim for her master's project. And we decided to explore whether or not insecticides might be contributing to this. Next slide. It was a very difficult study to run. It was a captive bred deer study. And we administered known doses of imidacloprid, which is one of the neonicotinoids, to these deer in their water. And then we measured their fitness over 2 years, including their fawn's fitnesses. Go ahead. Imidacloprid was associated in the spleens of these animals. The quantity of imidacloprid found in their spleens was related to increased fawn mortality. Next slide. But that wasn't all. It was also associated with reduced fawn body weights, fawn organ weights. The jaw bones were deformed in the fawns. Sounds familiar? Their hormones were affected, especially thyroid hormone levels. And the adult deer also displayed some adverse effects, and that was especially increased lethargy. What's a slow deer in the wild? That's a dead deer. So we were criticized early on by the study. They said, well, that's what you're able to generate under controlled conditions. What's things look like in the real world? And North Dakota ended up sending us, I think it was 200 or 300 deer spleens from hunter-killed animals. This is what we were able to generate under controlled conditions in the spleens of our captive bred deer. Next. Then, oops, back. The North Dakota deer spleens ended up having 3 times the amount that we were able to generate under controlled conditions. So these are very meaningful levels, even though very low doses of neonicotinoid insecticides are very toxic to organisms. Next. Minnesota said we would be very interested in learning a little bit more about this on our own, in our own world. And so they ended up going out to hunters around the state and collected 800 spleens from the hunter-killed deer. And nearly the majority of these were contaminated with imidacloprid. Next. North Dakota agreed, and they said, well, it may not stop with deer. And so they sent us about 100 each of hunter-killed fishers, bobcats, and river otters, all predators. And we were seeing an unexpected quantity of neonicotinoid contamination even in these animals. Next slide. But that's not the end of the story. Farmers are demonstrating all over the world, farmers are demonstrating that we don't have to use these things. In fact, they're probably hurting us more than they're helping us. And they're developing entirely new approaches to farming that's called regenerative agriculture. And when they go this route, they don't tend to have a lot of pest problems. Next slide. We have been studying these systems. We're one of the few research teams around the world that are doing that. And we've been trying to assess what is a regenerative farm and whether or not it is actually helping in terms of pest management as well as the resilience of the overall operation. Next, right there, yeah. So in croplands, we see reduced tillage, elimination of agrochemical use, increased use of cover crops, organic amendments to the soil, managing their field margins, and integrating animals ends up producing a very resilient farming system. In rangelands, they can eliminate their agrochemical use, things like porons and things like that on their animals, by increasing their stocking rates. They're moving those animals very frequently and then allowing the plant community to rest from grazing. Next slide, please. Insect diversity we're one of the first people that I think to show this, is that just by having more insects, and this is one of the reasons why insecticide use is so damaging, is because it actually ends up on when we look at this on a system scale, reducing the overall profit potential of the operation. We need insects in our farmland and in our rangeland. And we show that invertebrate diversity ends up increasing the profitability of, in this case, almond orchards. Next. And indeed, the more regenerative practices that farmers end up implementing, the more insect diversity that they end up generating on their operation. So invertebrate species richness is directly correlated with how many pests, inversely correlated with how many pests are in that system. Next. And many other responses also scale with this. So we can actually use this not only to reduce our dependence on insecticides, but also to increase carbon sequestration, soil health, biodiversity conservation, and the overall profitability and resilience of the farm. Next. And of course, the more regenerative you go, the more money you make. There you have it. Next. So many thanks to people. This research doesn't happen by conventional means. The farmers, the beekeepers, the ranchers around the world, you need to support it if you want to see this kind of science being done. Risk assessment science is not cheap, and it doesn't happen without your contributions. So look us up if you'd like to know more. There's our 501c3, and there's all the people that made this possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. Again, a ton there that there's a lot in there. And the one thing that I'll have, since I have time for one question, the one thing I'll ask about is, you talk about profitability of farms, which is, and farming methods and the profitability of regenerative farming. And I feel like it's so important to address costs, because as we know, the way that EPA assesses pesticides under FIFRA is not, to look at their health and environmental impacts independently, but to weigh them against these, do this cost benefit analysis. And I'm wondering, is there a way to use what you found about the profitability of these regenerative approaches within the way, the way that EPA looks at, regulates under FIFRA, or can it not, can it be used on their terms or not? Do you know what I'm saying?
Not entirely.
I guess what I mean is is under their whole cost benefit system, can this data be useful? Can it translate into that? Or do we have to abandon that system entirely?
Predicting the costs and benefits of a system are very challenging. It requires you to have a systems perspective. And that's very seldom done from a risk assessment perspective. Risk assessments are extremely difficult. Most often risk assessments are conducted under very confined conditions. When we look at systems, we have to define and characterize those systems using a range of different practices. And then we look at a number of different outcomes too. And profit is certainly one of them, but with regenerative agriculture, you're also looking at soil health, you're looking at biodiversity conservation, you're looking at nutrient density of the foods. Really, that's what our risk assessments should be looking at, shouldn't it? And that's what our farm business models should be looking at, because ultimately the overall profitability goes hand in hand with all of these other ecosystem services. So I think we really do need to kind of readjust our focus on risk assessments and making sure that we're looking at the things that really matter. And when you do, you find that this whole discussion on regulation of pesticides is kind of moot, because farmers don't need to spend the money on the junk to begin with.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Kyla Bennett, who is a PhD scientist and a lawyer who formerly worked at EPA. She is currently PURE's Northeast and Mid-Atlantic Director and PURE's Science Policy Director.
Thank you, Sharon. We've heard a lot about the impacts of pesticides on both human health and also on the environment and wildlife. And one of the things I want to talk about are hidden dangers in pesticides. And all of this reminds me of a quote from Rachel Carson in Silent Spring about pesticides. And she said, if we are going to live so intimately with these chemicals, eating and drinking them, taking them into the very marrows of our bones, we had better know something about their nature and their power. And the hard truth is that we don't know a lot about the nature and the power of these pesticides. And one of the reasons is that the agency is able to, EPA is able to keep from us a lot of the ingredients. We don't know many of the inert ingredients in pesticides, and they are often kept from us because of confidential business information. And one of the things that was really hard for me to swallow was the fact that we are now finding PFAS in a number of pesticides. We went down this PFAS rabbit hole a couple of years ago when I work and live in Massachusetts, and we found a lot of our drinking water in Massachusetts were contaminated with PFAS. Couldn't figure out why. And I tried to look for a pattern and saw that a lot of communities in southeastern Massachusetts were having contaminated drinking water. And there was no reason for it. No Department of Defense facility, no firefighting training facilities, no industry that would be leading to this contamination. So I started to think, what do these towns have in common? And one of the things that they have in common is that they are sprayed aerially with pesticides for mosquitoes, because here in southeastern Massachusetts, we are ground zero for a very rare yet often fatal disease called EEE, Eastern Equine Encephalitis. So I asked DEP in Massachusetts whether it's possible that the pesticide used to spray for these mosquitoes had PFAS. They told me no. They checked with EPA and EPA said no. And I didn't believe them. So we tested the Anvil 1010, the primary mosquitoicide that is used here in Massachusetts. Can I have the next slide, please, Elizabeth? So Pure has tested a number of pesticides, and so far we have found PFAS in 5 different pesticides from 5 different manufacturers. Anvil 1010, which is made by Clark and is for mosquitoes. Maverick Perimeter, which is made by Zoecon and is used for mosquitoes and ticks. Permanone 3030, which is very similar to Anvil 1010, also used for mosquitoes, and it's made by Bayer, no surprise there. And 2 herbicides, which I'm not going to mention by name here because we're still waiting for QA/QC from the lab, but they are 2 additional manufacturers, not the same manufacturers. Next slide, please. So why are we finding PFAS in pesticides? There are basically 4 reasons why we might be seeing this. The first is contamination from the manufacturing process. A lot of manufacturing equipment is non-stick to get every last drop of whatever it is they're manufacturing out. And PFAS, that non-stick coating, can leach into the product. PFAS might be deliberately added as inert ingredients. And in fact, if you go to EPA's list of approved inerts for pesticides, you will find a number of PFAS in there. They've told us that they are legacy, no one's using them, but nevertheless, they are there and they are approved. And PFAS can be quite handy for pesticides. They can be used as surfactants, as dispersants. They can help with the shelf life, all sorts of things, anti-foaming agents, things like that. Which leads us to the next one, which is deliberately added as active ingredients. Well, why on earth would we do that? They work. They work to kill insects, plants, things like that. And in fact, I worked with somebody from Massachusetts Sierra Club. We were looking at the list of pesticides registered in Massachusetts and found that there are a number of PFAS that are used as active ingredients in the approved list. We're talking hundreds of pesticides that have PFAS that have been approved. And finally, the last reason we might be seeing PFAS in these pesticides is contamination from containers. And indeed, when EPA looked at why we were finding PFAS in Anvil, they said that it was from the HDPE containers, which were fluorinated. And we regulate PFAS to the part per trillion. It's a very, very toxic chemical that can lead to, it's linked to cancers and all sorts of health issues. And when EPA tested these barrels, they were finding parts per billion in both the inside and the outside. And clearly it was leaching off from those barrels into the pesticide. Next slide, please. So what is EPA's position on this? EPA took very seriously the issue with Anvil, but as we find more and more PFAS and additional pesticides, I think they're getting a little frustrated. They did with the Anvil tell all municipalities and states who had the existing stock to discontinue use and hold it, not to apply it, and the manufacturer did take the contaminated supply back. EPA also said that any level of PFAS is going to be considered potentially toxicologically significant and may trigger a provision of FIFRA that requires registrants to report what they call impurities within 30 days. But we don't know what this means. What does this mean? Does this mean that EPA can require manufacturers to test all of the pesticides for PFAS? And if so, are they going to be required to remove them? We don't have answers to those questions. Next slide, please. This screenshot here is from EPA's Inert Finder. This is just a handful, not all of these are PFAS, but most of them are, a handful of the PFAS that are allowed as approved inerts. And so I just put this up to remind me that EPA needs to do a number of things. First of all, they need to reconcile their definition of PFAS. They have a master list of PFAS. It's called the CompTox master list, and it was developed by the National Center for Computational Toxicology. Currently has 9,252 PFAS chemicals on there. EPA does not consider all of these to be PFAS, and that's a problem. The United Nations Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, they're an international standard setting agency. They define PFAS as all compounds containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon. And so they believe that the PFAS definition should be fairly expansive. EPA needs to adopt this definition of PFAS and regulate them all. EPA currently is more concerned with what they call the prominent PFAS, the two C8s, PFOA and PFAS. Those are the only two that they're considering regulating at this time. They currently regulate none. And as I've said, they are allowed both as inert ingredients and active ingredients in pesticides. So EPA needs to regulate PFAS as a class. They cannot, on the one hand, say that any amount of PFAS in pesticides is toxicologically significant, and on the other hand, allow them as both inert and active ingredients. States are scrambling right now to fill the void, the regulatory void left by EPA. EPA has done nothing, very little. They're slow walking this issue. And so while states are scrambling to determine the extent of the contamination in our soil, our water, and our drinking water, EPA is trying to figure out whether they should regulate 2 out of 9,252. It's nonsensical for these states and municipalities to be paying millions of dollars to clean up PFAS contamination, while at the same time EPA is allowing these very chemicals to be sprayed from trucks and from the skies on our crops and all over because of insects that might be a problem. We need to get industry influence out of the agency. We need to increase transparency. We need to use the precautionary principle, regulating all PFAS as a class, defining them well, and getting them out of our pesticides. Finally, last thing I want to say is that the burden for finding these things in pesticides should not be on small NGOs like Pure, and EPA really needs to step up to the plate. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyla. I want to ask one quick question. So it's clear, you've made it very clear what EPA has to do, and the burden shouldn't be on Peer and other groups like it. And yet you've done this work on your own, and you've really taken really big steps just by establishing, what you've shown us. What are your next steps for pushing this forward, assuming, I think it's pretty safe to assume you're already out ahead. Where do you go next with this in terms of what's your next step?
That's a good question, Sharon. And we're doing a number of things. We're trying to push EPA to regulate PFAS as a class and to ban all non-essential uses of PFAS, not just in pesticides, but in all consumer products. Because honestly, they're in everything. They're in dental floss and mascara and guitar strings and piano keys and solar panels and food containers and just everywhere. And it's ridiculous because most of these uses are definitely not essential, and they are forever chemicals. They cannot be destroyed, and they are harming us and harming the environment. We're also working at the state level. For example, here in Massachusetts, we've got some bills that we're putting forward with legislative partners to try to get PFAS out of pesticides, out of things like firefighter turnout gear and all sorts of other consumer products. But it's going to be a hard sell because the PFAS manufacturing, the industry is very powerful. They're very rich, and they are not shy about trying to insert themselves into processes to try to fight states even that are trying to come up with MCLs and trying to regulate even just a handful of these 9,000 or more PFAS chemicals. So we've got a hard road ahead of us.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, next and finally, we have Lorianne Bird, who is the Environmental Health Program Director and a senior attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity. She directs the center's efforts to protect all species, including humans, from the harmful effects of toxic substances, focusing especially on improving the regulation of pesticides, air pollution, factory farms, water contamination, and making the world safer for pollinators.
Hi, good afternoon. We've already learned a lot from the other panelists here, and it's obvious that our pesticide regulatory system is broken. We have new studies coming out every day showing that American agriculture is getting increasingly toxic. We have new studies and stories coming out every day showing the toll chemical use in American agriculture is taking on farm workers and frontline communities. Right now, there's a disaster unfolding in Tampa Bay where radioactive chemical-filled waste from phosphate mining, which is used for fertilizer and as an ingredient in pesticides, is pouring into the bay, and there's little we can do to stop it right now. And we're watching the sixth great extinction unfold around us, with new research telling us that we're in an insect apocalypse, that once common animals ranging from butterflies, birds, frogs, and fishes, they're all disappearing. And pesticides are playing an outsized role. We want a world that's alive, healthy, flourishing. We want to always be able to marvel in the migration of monarch butterflies and for kids to chase fireflies on warm summer nights. But that won't be in the cards, honestly, unless we change how pesticides are regulated. And if there's one thing, just one thing I communicate to you today, it's that we can absolutely change how pesticides are regulated. And the main thing we need to make that change is the political will to do it. Yes, FIFRA, our pesticide regulatory law, is broken. But the main thing about it that's broken is that it leaves way too much room for discretion in the hands of an agency that's shown itself time and time again to be willing to bend over backwards for the pesticide industry and throw the rest of us under the bus. But it doesn't have to be that way. Here are a few examples, recent things. EPA's pesticide office claims that under the law, it can't require pesticide labels in any language other than English. But here's what the law actually says. I'll just read to you so you believe me. All required label or labeling text shall appear in the English language. However, the agency may require or the applicant may propose additional text in other languages as is considered necessary to protect the public. And if you still don't believe me, it's 40 CFR 156.10. So there's absolutely nothing preventing EPA's pesticide office from having pesticide labels in applicator appropriate languages. And making that change would go a long way towards protecting life. Another example of EPA using its discretion the wrong way, after a front page story in USA Today about EPA doing nothing about a pesticide impregnated dog collar receiving 75,000 reports of harms ranging from skin irritation to pets dying, it defended itself by saying it had no statutory mandate to investigate those complaints. Again, there's discretion there. It absolutely could investigate, it just chose not to, and it didn't have to. And then there's cancellation under the imminent hazard standard of FIFRA. Nate talked about a couple pesticides in the US that are still used that aren't, well, a lot of pesticides in the US that are still used that aren't used in other nations. The imminent hazard provision hasn't been dusted off since 1986. It's just been sitting there. Again, that's EPA's discretion. It could absolutely dust off that provision and apply it to some of the most dangerous pesticides we still have on the market in the US, like paraquat, aldicarb, for example. So yes, this is a long way of saying we need FIFRA reform, but there's a ton we can do without reforming the statute, simply by mustering the political will and effecting a cultural shift in EPA's pesticide office. We need to hold our chemical regulators accountable. We need congressional inquiries, we need GAO investigations, we need hearings, we need all your ideas. We at the center are bringing all the reports and petitions and litigation that we can. We're drinking from a fire hose, but we really need everyone to do their part. And there are lots of other groups doing great work. We need more. There's so much need here. We need to act like our lives depend on these changes to pesticide regulation, because they do. So as was mentioned earlier, pesticide regulation is basically a cost-benefit analysis. And so EPA's regulators do a balancing act, deciding whether the cost of a pesticide outweigh its benefits. Of course, a lot of work goes into this, but at the end of the day, it's a judgment call about what's acceptable and what's not. And so we need EPA to start asking big questions and properly assessing the real costs of the pesticides that they are charged with regulating. For example, how do you balance the cost of a class of chemicals driving an insect apocalypse with the benefit of allowing the seeds to be coated with pesticides that are then planted on millions of acres of farmland for prophylactic protection? So there's no actual pest threat, but just in case there is, we're going to coat those seeds, plant them on hundreds of millions of acres. Right now, that's okay. But we need EPA to take a hard look at that and really factor in the real costs and the real benefits. For example, USDA has said farmers don't even get any benefit from soybean seeds that are coated with neonicotinoid pesticides because they have to pay a little bit more for those seeds. So it doesn't outweigh the benefit, which is very minimal, doesn't outweigh the cost, but it's still allowed. So there's a big picture reckoning that needs to happen, a cultural shift, a policy shift. But right now, there are actually a lot of really common sense things that could happen that EPA could decide to make happen, and they make a really big difference. So for example, EPA has been allowing the use of pesticides that are not approved for specific uses, often because they're just too dangerous, or the pesticides aren't approved at all, for use as emergency exemptions under Section 18 of FIFRA. So, what's an emergency? An emergency is something that pops up that you couldn't have possibly seen happening, and now you need to deal with this emergency. But EPA approves these emergency exemptions year after year after year in the same place for the same emergency, same crop, same chemicals, sometimes 9 years in a row. A couple years ago, we submitted a petition to EPA asking them to stop allowing this. There's no way something happening 9 consecutive years in a row is an emergency. It's a loophole that EPA is allowing to be abused. So we asked them to close that loophole. They've taken no action on it. This is something that EPA could act on right now to stop the abuse of these emergency exemptions. Another thing is that EPA pretends that pesticides are just used one active ingredient at a time. And the inert ingredients in those pesticide bottles have no effect whatsoever. But we know that pesticides are used at the same time in US agriculture. One corn seed might have 5 pesticide coatings on it. Tank mixes of pesticides are incredibly common, and EPA refuses to look at how these pesticides and their ingredients are interacting. Again, they've got petitions pending on those issues that propose common sense solutions to analyze these issues. And they could choose to grant those petitions and proceed with rulemaking to regulate the pesticides as they're actually used rather than in imaginary laboratory conditions. Well, not in laboratory conditions that don't mimic the real world. So speaking of lab conditions, EPA can also stop relying on just industry studies and start incorporating peer-reviewed science in their ecological risk assessments and epidemiology in their human health risk assessments. They say they're relying on good laboratory practices. That's a standard they have for what studies they'll allow. But that standard basically precludes most things except industry studies in these processes. And that's a real loss in their analysis. EPA has also steadfastly refused to comply with the Endangered Species Act, except when forced by litigation. Endangered species are the canary in the coal mine. Protecting them protects all of us. It's obviously important to protect them so they don't go extinct, but the benefits of protecting them extend beyond just those species. EPA can absolutely right now declare that their decades of intransigence are over, and they will comply with the Endangered Species Act, complete Endangered Species Act consultation for every single new pesticide that they register, and go back through their backlog and do Endangered Species Act consultation for 50 pesticides a year, every year going forward, prioritizing the most dangerous pesticides. They can do this. It's just a matter of allocating resources and political will to this work rather than the work of focusing on doing industry's bidding. And in the meantime, they can implement mitigation measures to protect the most vulnerable. EPA hasn't implemented a single on-the-ground mitigation measure for any endangered species, not even the most imperiled ones with the narrowest possible range. Committing to some mitigation would go a really long ways. So that's all. I could go on, but let's take some questions.
Thank you. Yes, and I'm going to go straight to questions from the audience instead of taking my own because we're a little behind. And I would encourage everybody who wants to submit a question to do that now. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and ask the first one from Daniel Horowitz. And I guess this is really a question for Nathan. It says, it's also worth noting that aldicarbs manufacturing is one of the worst processes around. It uses MIC, which was the chemical that caused the Bhopal disaster in 1984. Is this a general trend that the deadliest pesticides are also the most polluting in manufacturing? Nathan, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. And that's a great question and a good point to bring up because the harms from these chemicals don't just begin and end when they're used. They begin at synthesis. Many pesticides are synthetic chemicals. They need to be synthesized in labs. In fact, there's an entire phosphate mine in Idaho whose sole purpose is to mine phosphate from the ground to use to synthesize glyphosate. So there's environmental harms, there's human health harms associated with the extraction of materials as well as the manufacturing process. And if you look on EPA's ECHO database, just at pesticide manufacturing facilities, you'll find dozens that are currently in violation of RCRA and the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. I know because I just did this about a month ago. And these facilities lie disproportionately in lower income communities, and often communities of color. And so those communities are the ones who are bearing this disproportionate burden of pollution from these facilities. So I don't know about whether the more harmful pesticides have a more harmful manufacturing process. I'm sure that is true to some extent, but it's important that harms associated with a pesticide don't just begin and end with their use. We really need a cradle to the grave approach of how does this pesticide harm human health and the environment from beginning to end.
Thanks. So the next question is, I guess, probably for Lorianne, but if anybody wants to jump in, and it is from Colin Blaze. I hope I'm saying your name right. And it is specifically, what actions can members of Congress take to both raise awareness for and take action on these issues with pesticide abuse?
I think some oversight would really go a long way. As one thing. There are also some bills out there. PACT-PA is the FIFRA reform bill that we have protecting, oh, Nate, help me here, or someone, protecting America's children. Sorry, I'm totally blanking. I'll get to it in a second, but supporting our pesticide legislation, PACT-PA, that reforms FIFRA also is a really important action, but oversight hearings. There are also some standalone bills on specific chemicals that would be great to support. And those are a few things off the top of my head, but I don't know if others have ideas.
I think it's really important for us to, not just focus on the pesticide issue, but also look at alternatives, because there is a perceived need for these things in farming operations. And making sure that folks understand that there is alternatives and supporting those alternatives with equal resources to what we're devoting into regulating pesticides, as well as yeah, I think that would be a really strategic move. Otherwise, we're just going to replace one problem with another.
Okay. Next question from Bill Hurst.
Can I just jump in? The
Yes.
name of the legislation is Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act.
Thanks.
Thanks.
This question is from Bill Hersey. EPA adopted its principles of scientific integrity in 2000. What do you think of the effectiveness of these principles in assessing registration and re-registration of pesticides? And P.S. He was labor co-chair of EPA's national partnership when NPC got EPA to adopt the PSI. Sorry.
I can take this one, Sharon. You know, on paper, the scientific integrity principles are great, but in reality, they don't work. This EPA's scientific integrity policy, which basically takes those principles and codifies them, if you will, in a memo, has no process by which to resolve any complaints that employees have. They claim that these employees will be safe from retaliation, and they're not. The Scientific Integrity Office has a backlog of hundreds of complaints, literally hundreds of complaints that have not been addressed. So, you know, my frustration with EPA grows every day, and there are some great people there, and a lot of the career people who are trying very hard to do the right thing in both the pesticides office and other offices are finding that it's impossible to use the scientific integrity policy or that process that's laid out for them, or the lack of a process to get anything accomplished. So unfortunately, that is not the answer. But just as an aside, PEER is working to try to get the scientific integrity policy at all federal agencies changed and more useful to the employees who can use them.
Thank you. Here's a question from Jeannie Economos. And it is, the information and these studies would be important points to make in the USDA's current call for comments on the climate crisis in agriculture. Is there an intention to submit comments on regenerative ag benefits in the USDA comment period?
I'm not sure that USDA even understands what regenerative agriculture is yet. And there's been a lot of bandying about as far as what definition describes it. I think our group is one of the only ones that's tried to put out an empirically tested system that seems to work pretty well. So I think there's a lot of influencers at play within USDA right now. It's a very, very tenuous time for regen ag. And we need to have data-driven decision making here. That doesn't seem to be happening much. So
I think we have time for one last, and this is a big one, so maybe we should end here. And it is, isn't a total rewrite of FIFRA needed? This is, I'm sorry, from Richard Andrews. Not just Band-Aid adjustments. For example, a bill submitted by Representatives Neguse and Senator Udall last year tried to make modifications. Can we form a team to do a total rewrite?
Sure, that'd be great. Absolutely. You know, but we're working with what we have now, and new environmental legislation, you know, hasn't passed in decades, and, you know, meaningful big picture environmental legislation. So we're working with what we have now, but I love the energy, and if there's an effort, we would love to support it.
Can I do one last? Okay. This is from Pierre Minot. It is also worthwhile to add that one of the dominant issues with aldicarb was broad evidence of drinking water contamination. Has this been considered in the Florida situation?
It's been given lip service. I don't know if it's been fully considered. There's been some mitigations put in place. I think there's a 500 or 1,000 foot buffer between where you can use aldicarb and a drinking water well. And they've also mandated that you have to bury the aldicarb granules 3 inches below in the ground to theoretically prevent runoff from the application. But this is sort of the frustration is, you know, with pesticides like aldicarb or paraquat, you can't put in enough mitigations to help the problem. So that's EPA's motto is keep calm and mitigate on, which is just so incredibly frustrating, because when you're trying to mitigate the problems from some of the most toxic pesticides ever used, you just can't do it. And so EPA needs to accept that fact and be like, there are just some pesticides that you cannot use, period. And aldicarb certainly should be one of them.
It looks like I can do even one more. This one's from Liza Gross, fellow journalist. The Biden administration is reviewing regulatory rollbacks under Trump and policies based on bad science. Is there a mechanism for scientists like yourselves to feed into this and reform policy at EPA?
I can take a stab at this. We're sure trying. We are doing our best to insert ourselves into that process on many different levels. And a lot of it I can't talk about because Pure has clients that are employees who bring us confidential issues that we're trying to, you know, they're whistleblowers, and we're trying to let them keep their jobs while we address the underlying environmental issue. So I guess what I can say is we are trying. I don't know how far we'll get. I mean, right now, the Biden administration is saying a lot of things that sound really good, but at some point that door is going to close and they're just going to keep on doing what they're doing. And, you know, this is not just, I just want to point out that the problems that we're seeing is not just from the Trump administration. The past 4 years were horrific for the environment and for EPA, but these problems have been going on for decades. And the pesticide program is broken and needs to be fixed. It's been broken for a long, long time. And I am cautiously optimistic that the Biden administration will do some things, but I think it's going to take a hell of a lot of work to fix it all.
Thank you. So great. So unfortunately, that's really the end of our time. But I want to encourage you, you can see all our contact information. It's here. And I want to encourage you to ask your questions directly through email to everybody who is on the panel. And I want to thank everybody who was on the panel for sharing your wisdom and your work. And I want to thank everyone who attended for coming. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This is Tim Whitehouse from Peer. I just wanted to let you know we will be putting a recording of this webinar on our YouTube station. We will send an email to all participants. There was a problem in the first few minutes of the recording, but most of it will be up on our website. So thank you very much. And if you have further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to all of us.